Hi everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we're going to talk about views and their relevance in the Django web framework. Now a view basically is a function that takes in an HTTP request and then returns an HTTP response. So basically a view is where all the logic or all the functionality that you are required to basically call when you go to a certain web page is written. So for example, when you create a first view, so I'm going to head over to our post app right here, and what I'll do is to head over to the views module or the views.py file. So we're going to create our first view, which is going to be a simple function that's going to return for us a hello world message. So I'm going to come right in here and I'll create a simple function. I'll call this function our index function. Now this is supposed to take in a request, so I'll specify the request to just be our parameter, which is going to be a request. Now you can even specify the type of this request because this request is always of the type HTTP request. So we can go ahead and import our HTTP request class from Django. So I'll do that by saying from Django. Now say .http. We shall go ahead and import our HTTP request class just like that. So using type hints, I can go ahead and basically state the type of this request parameter to be our HTTP request. Now that we have this, I can go ahead and specify what this is actually going to return. So what we're going to return in this case is going to be an HTTP response. So to return our HTTP response, I'm going to import the HTTP response class from Django.http. So to do that, what I'll do is to import it just like we've imported our HTTP request. So I import our HTTP response and then I'll just come right here and what I'll do is to say return. And in this case, we're going to return our HTTP response. Sorry for that. So this will be our HTTP response. Now, HTTP response takes in the content or the message or what you want to actually return in this response. So what I'm going to do is to specify that we just want to simply return hello world. And now this is our view function. Now, if you to notice, what we have is a simple function that basically takes in a request object and then returns an HTTP response. Now what this means is when we head over to a URL on our app, for example, if our app was www.facebook.com, actually this is going to be facebook.com. So if our website had such a URL and we are to visit the /URL or the /endpoint or the route, what we would have is this function being called, and what we'll be seeing is our hello world message. So for now we haven't yet attached this view onto a URL, but let's go ahead and attach it to a simple URL. So to attach this to a URL, we'll have to create a URL patterns, or actually you have to create a list of URL patterns that are going to be specific to this specific post app. So for us to be able to do that, I'm going to go ahead and create a new urls.py module within our posts app. And this URL modules is going to contain a list of all the URLs that will be specific to our post app. So what I'm going to do is to import a certain function from Django that's going to allow us to create such paths. So I'm just going to come and say from Django.urls, which is the URLs module, I'm going to go ahead and import our path function. Now using this path function, we're going to be able to map all our views, all functions, and then we map them onto URLs that we can basically access on our main website. So to do this, what I'm going to do is to come to URLs and then I'll create a list of URL patterns. So I'll call this URL patterns. And this URL patterns list is simply going to be a list, and this is the way you spell it. It's kind of a convention to keep it to URL patterns. Otherwise, Django won't be able to notice that you actually have some URL patterns here. So with that, let's go ahead and continue. So now that we have a list of URL patterns, what I'm going to go and do is to call our path function to create a URL pattern. So to create one, I'm going to just come and call this function. So it takes in the route as the first argument. So our route in this case is going to actually be our root route or our root endpoint on our application, just like I gave the example of www.facebook .com, and then when you go to slash, that will actually be the root endpoint of our website. So let me remove this, and then the second argument is actually going to be the view function itself. So in this case, we're going to specify a view function, and in this case what we shall have to do is to import our views. So I'll go to the top of our code right here, and then I'll say from dot, we are actually going to import our views module. So this is actually how we're going to be accessing all the views that are specific to our posts app. So I'm just going to come right here and say views dot, in this case I'll import our index view, and then I'll give it a name. So in this case what I'm going to do is to give it a name. So this name is going to help us when you're accessing our URL as a function, just like we're going to see in the coming videos. So right now I'm just going to call this our home. I'll just call this our post. Actually, I'm just going to call it the posts home, and this is good to go. We've created a URL for our app, but we have not been able to tell Django that we are actually going to have URL specific to posts being accessed over our project. So to do that, we're going to be able to register our URL patterns to our main app so that we can be able to actually access them within our project. So let's go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do is to go ahead and save. I'm going to save this. I'll also save our views.py, and what I'll do in this case is to come and go to our project, which is our blog project right here. So I'll go to our urls.py file, and what I'll do is I'm going to first remove this comment right here. So what we have is URL patterns, but these URL patterns are actually similar to the URL patterns we've created right here. But the difference is that these URL patterns are actually one specific to our entire project, while these are actually specific to our posts app. Now, when we map our URL patterns from the whole project, and then we come and register them right here, what we actually do is to allow our URLs be accessed project-wise. So let's go ahead and include our posts URLs onto our main project so that you can be able to actually access them on our main site. Now I'm going to import a function from Django.urls that's going to simply allow us to get URLs from a module and then include them onto our main project URL patterns. So to do that, what I'm going to come and do is I'm going to import a function called the include function. Sorry for that. So this is actually going to be our input function. And when you import this include function, I'm simply going to come right here, and what I'll do is to create a path. So I'm going to call a path function, and I'm going to provide our root URL, and this is actually going to be a blank URL, meaning our root URL. And within here, instead of saying views, just like we've been having here, in this case we're just going to simply include URLs from a separate app. So I'm just going to come and say include, and then I'm going to call this function so it takes in arguments. So in this case I'll provide the URLs that you want to actually include. So we shall point to the app, which is our posts app. So I'll just come right here and say posts, and then continue by saying dot URLs. Now that we have this, I'm going to go ahead and save. Now that we've saved this, we can be able to actually access our URLs on our entire project. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up my terminal right here. So we have a virtual environment, but we haven't yet activated it. Now I'm going to first activate it with source, and then env since I'm on Linux, bin, and then activate. So when I go ahead and run our project, so I'll run this with Python 3 money.py, and then run server. Our server will run, and then we are going to be able to access our app at localhost 8000. We have some unapplied migrations, but do not mind about this. We shall look at this when we are looking at models. So what I'll do is to click on our localhost 8000, and this is actually going to go ahead and open up our app. So just like we see here, we have our response returned to us. So what happens each time we refresh this page is we are making a request to our localhost 8000/endpoint. So even when we go back to our terminal right here, what we have is a request made with a GET method to our root endpoint, and then you also see an HTTP response returned with a status code of 200. So basically each time we create a request, so let me refresh here, we are actually requesting for the /endpoint, and our view function is going to be executed, and then we shall return a response. So let's go ahead and create a new view function. So I'll just create a new function, and then let's say this function is actually going to take in a name, and it's going to return for us a greeting for that name. So in this case, I'll come and say greet, and in this case we shall say it's going to be greeting, but it's going to take in a request because it's a view function, and then this will actually return for us the name. So let's say I want to pass this name through a query string or through a query parameter. In this case, we shall come and say return hello, and then actually what we want to actually do is to specify that we want to return a response containing our name. So let's say we want to return an HTTP response, and this HTTP response is going to be a greeting that's going to greet our name. So let's look at how we can be able to get our name from our query string. So what we're going to do in this case is to come and say that our name is actually going to be our request.get. So request.get is going to be a dictionary that's going to contain all our parameters that we're going to pass in our URL. So what I'm going to do is to actually pass in this case we can say request.get, and I'll come and specify what we need here. So that is actually going to be our name. So once we have this, then what we need to do is to return our name, or when you don't have the name, what we want to actually say is we're going to return hello world. So when we have this, let me actually close the terminal for now. So what I'll do is to come and say hello, and in this case we shall pass in our name since we want to return a greeting for our name. So when I save this, I'm going to attach this to our URL pattern. So I'll just come to our URLs of our posts app. Now that we've registered our URLs onto our project, we don't need to actually register this again. So I'll have to only add that URL to our posts app. So I'll just come right here and say path. And in this case, we shall say it's going to be greet. So in this case, we're going to have greet. And I'm going to attach the view. So I'll say views dot. In this case, it's going to be greet. So I can as well as give this a name of greet. Then let's say name. So when I have this, what I'm going to do is to go to our browser. So I'll go to my Chrome right here. So instead of going to our root URL, in this case, what I'm going to do is to actually go to our /URL. So I'm just going to actually go to /greet. And now we have hello world, meaning that's actually going to give us our name as world. So that's when we have not provided our name. So when I go right here, we have not provided our name. So it's seeing our world as our name. Now let's say we provide our name. So I'm just going to come right in here. And what I'll do is to provide our name as a query parameter. So I'll come right here and say that our name is going to be equal to, let's say, Jonah. And when we have this, we now see that it's actually returning for us our name as Jonah. So right now we've been able to see that view functions take in requests and they return HTTP responses. But now let's see how we can return some data. So what I'm going to come and do is to create a list of posts. So these posts are actually going to be some dummy data that we're going to see and use before we create our database. So I'm just going to come right here. We're going to create a simple posts list. Now this is just going to be a simple in-memory database. We're going to have posts. So each post is going to have an ID. It will have a title. And let's say this is going to be learn Django. So it's actually going to have an author. And let's say the author is Sally Jonathan. So when we have this, I can actually go ahead and copy paste this. So I'm just going to come right here and I'm going to copy paste these. So what we have here is a list of posts. Now what we're going to actually do is to assign different IDs. So I'm actually going to assign ID 2 and ID 3. So what you can actually do is to call this, let's say, learn Python, and let's say we're going to name this learn, actually it's going to be JavaScript for beginners. So once you have this, then what you can do is to actually go ahead and return this in a response. So I'm going to come right here, and what I'll do is to come and write a view function. So I may call this return all posts, and this will take in a request just like we've constructed our view functions. So this will be taking in our HTTP request, and then we are simply going to return our HTTP responses. So in this case, we want to return some content or an object. So what you want to actually do is to return, so just like you see here, we return an HTTP response class with a string as content. So what you can actually do is to just return a string of our post. So I can actually just come right here and turn our posts list into a string. So when I do this, I'm going to attach this to a URL. So I'll just come right in our URLs here. So what I'm going to actually do is to return a path, and in this case what I'm going to do is to call this path posts. Then we shall attach this to our view, and then what we're actually going to do is to specify that our view function is going to be one for returning all posts, and then we can say we're giving this a name of all posts. So once we have this, then what I'm going to do is to go to our browser and try to access this URL. So I'm just going to come right to our browser here, and I'm going to remove this. So when I come right here to our posts, actually we see that we don't have a URL for that. So let's actually see, we go to /posts. Actually this is /grid/posts, so we need to access this on our posts, and now we see a string representation of all our posts. So let's try to access one URL, actually one post from our list. So what we're going to do is to actually pass an argument within our URL. So I'm just going to come right in our project here, and I'll go to our views. So I'm going to create one specific view that's going to return only one post. So I'll do that with, in this case, we're going to return, sorry for this, so I'll just come and say return one post, and we shall have a request, and this request is going to take in an HTTP. So this will actually be the HTTP request, and this is actually going to return an HTTP response. So in this case we shall return an HTTP response, but we want to actually return is going to be one single post, so we shall return that string as a post. And now let's say we want to get that post with it by its ID, so we shall pass in the post ID. So in this case what I'm going to do is to pass in a post ID, and since we want this post, I can come and also specify that what we want is to actually search for that post. So we can do that by looping through all the posts. So I can say for post in posts, and what we want to do is to find if that post contains that ID. Then we can say if post, since it's a dictionary, each post is actually a dictionary right here. So what you can do is to actually say if post ID is equal to the post ID, and then what we can do is to basically specify that we actually want to return that specific post. So I can come right in here, and what I can do is to return this HTTP response with that string as a post. So what we can do is to return our post and then return that post with that specific ID. So once we have that, then what we can actually, we are actually returning the post itself. So in this case, we want to return the post in our HTTP response. But in case we don't have the post, what we can do is to return a message simply showing that that post doesn't exist. So we are going to just come right in here and return our HTTP request, and then let's say it's going to be not found. So when I save this, hoping that our server is still running, we are fine. So what we're going to do is to create a URL for this. We're going to go to our posts urls.py, and what I'll do is to create a path, and this path is going to be on the /posts, and then here we're going to pass in an argument within our URL. So in this case, what we want is to specify the type of that argument. It's going to be our ID, and it's actually going to be an integer. So our integer is going to be an ID, and then we shall basically attach a view onto this URL. So I'll just come right here and say views dot, in this case we want to return one post, so I'll come and say return one post, and then we shall give this a name. So this name is actually going to be get one post. So I'll save this, and when I save this, then when you go to our browser, when you try to access one post by its ID, so for example a post with the ID of 1, in this case what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come right here, and what I'll do is to access a post with the ID of 1. So we actually return, we have an ID of, we have unexpected argument of ID. We made a mistake there, so it's actually supposed to be our post ID. So when you have our post ID within our URL, we also need to specify that as an argument to our view function. So when I come right back here and refresh, we now see a string representation of the post with ID of 1. So in this video, we've been able to look at views, which are simply functions that take in HTTP requests and then return HTTP responses. Thank you for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video and you found it valuable, the way you can help me is leaving a like so that you make this video accessible to everyone who may want to learn Django. And don't forget to subscribe if you're new to this channel. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye.